Hello there, and welcome to Sleepy Science Vault. Right now, in this very moment, you are not seeing the world as it truly is. What you believe to be reality, the room around you, the light on the walls, the feeling of stillness, is something your brain has assembled for you. Carefully. Quietly. Without ever asking your permission. Scientists call it a controlled hallucination. And the more you understand what that means, the more extraordinary the ordinary world becomes. Your brain is not a camera. It does not record what is out there and play it back for you faithfully. Perception is not photographic. It is constructive, meaning your brain is actively building reality, moment by moment, using whatever partial information it can gather, filling the gaps, smoothing the edges, making it all feel seamless. What arrives at your eyes, your ears, your skin, is just raw data. Fragments. Electrical signals. And before any of that becomes something you can actually experience, your brain has already begun its work, predicting what those signals most likely mean, based on everything it has ever learned. This is one of the most quietly remarkable things about you. Your brain does not wait for the world to fully explain itself before showing you a picture. Instead, it generates a prediction first, and then checks whether reality agrees. Most of the time, it does. Most of the time, the prediction is close enough that you never notice the process at all. But what you are living inside is, in the most technical sense, a model. A simulation built from guesses and corrections and past experience. Not a lie exactly, but not the unfiltered truth either. Think of it this way. The reality your brain shows you is not meant to be a perfect copy of what exists. It is meant to be useful. It is a kind of interface, something like the display on a screen, designed not to show you everything, but to show you just enough to navigate, to survive, to act. The icons on a computer screen are not the actual files and circuits underneath. They are simplified representations, designed to make the system usable. Your conscious experience works in much the same way. What you see is not the raw data. It is a clean, compressed version, something your brain has already interpreted and organized and decided is worth showing you. And to do all of this in real time, with almost no delay, the brain makes extraordinary trade-offs. It downsamples. It compresses. It takes the overwhelming flood of sensory information pouring in every second and reduces it, ruthlessly, into something manageable. Right now, your visual system is only processing a small fraction of what your eyes could theoretically detect. Most of the detail in your peripheral vision is invented, inferred, patched together from memory and expectation. You believe you see a full, rich, continuous world. And yet only a tiny region of your visual field is ever truly in sharp focus at any moment. The rest is your brain quietly filling in what it assumes must be there. It favors efficiency over completeness. Because completeness is expensive. Because the brain runs on roughly 20 watts of energy, less than a dim light bulb, and it has to make every calculation count. And here is where it becomes truly fascinating. The brain does not just compress the world. It also hides the fact that it is compressing. It does not show you the seams. It does not reveal the places where it guessed, or the edges of your focus, or the gaps in your attention. It presents the final result as if it were simply, what is there? You are never aware of the machinery. You never feel the thousands of micro-decisions happening beneath every moment of seeing, hearing, touching. The brain keeps all of that hidden, not out of deception, but because surfacing it would be overwhelming. Because the work it does is most effective when it is invisible. And even more quietly, it hides its own limitations from you. When your vision fails at the edges, you do not see darkness or blur. You see more world, imagined into place. When your attention misses something, you rarely notice the gap. The experience of consciousness feels complete, even when the underlying process is riddled with shortcuts. Your brain is not just hiding the wiring from you. It is making sure you never even think to look for it. And somehow, knowing all of this does not make the world feel less real. If anything, it makes it feel more astonishing. That from raw electrical signals and predictive guesswork and ruthless compression, something as rich and vivid and continuous as a human life can emerge. That what you are experiencing right now, this quiet, this stillness, this moment, is something your brain has built for you, perfectly and invisibly, as it has done every single moment since you came into the world. 2 flat images. That is all your eyes actually deliver to your brain. Each retina captures a slightly different angle of the world, a thin, 2-dimensional impression, like a photograph taken from just a few inches apart. And yet what you experience is not 2 flat pictures. What you experience is depth, distance. A world with weight and dimension and space stretching away from you in every direction. That experience of 3-dimensional reality is not something that arrives from outside. Your brain builds it. It takes those 2 flat signals, compares the tiny differences between them, and from that comparison, it constructs an entire sense of space. The feeling that objects are near or far, that the room has a back wall, that your hand is closer to you than the window. It does this so automatically, so completely, that the construction never feels like construction at all. It feels like simply seeing. And building depth is only the beginning. Your visual input is, in reality, far more incomplete than it feels. The retina has a blind spot, a place where the optic nerve connects and no light-sensitive cells exist at all. Everything that falls on that point in your visual field simply produces no signal. Nothing. A gap in the data. And yet you have never seen that gap. You have never noticed a hole in your vision, a missing patch of world. Because your brain fills it in. It looks at what surrounds the blind spot, makes an intelligent guess about what should be there, and inserts it, seamlessly, instantly, without any awareness on your part. This is not an unusual trick your brain performs in rare circumstances. It is something happening constantly, in every moment of every waking hour. The visual world you inhabit is full of places where the data was incomplete, ambiguous, or simply absent, and full of places where your brain quietly invented the rest. The experience of continuous, unbroken space is itself a kind of construction. The information your senses gather is actually spotty, interrupted, uneven, riddled with gaps in both space and time. And yet consciousness presents it to you as smooth, as whole. as a single uninterrupted experience of being somewhere real. Your brain is relentlessly smoothing. Wherever there is a discontinuity, a jump in the signal, a moment of missing information, it reaches in and stitches the seams closed. The world feels continuous because continuity is what your brain works hardest to create. And perhaps nothing illustrates this more strangely than what happens every time your eyes move. Your eyes are not still. Even when you feel like you are gazing calmly at something, your eyes are in constant motion, darting in small rapid jumps called saccades, several times each second, repositioning themselves to bring different parts of the world into focus. During each of these movements, the image on your retina sweeps and blurs. The signal becomes, for a brief moment, a smear of motion. You never see that blur. The brain detects that a saccade is about to happen, and in the moment the eyes begin to move, it suppresses the visual signal entirely. It essentially turns off your visual awareness for the duration of the movement and then turns it back on when the eyes have settled, presenting you with the new stable image as though no movement occurred at all. Researchers call this saccadic suppression. And it means that you are, in a very real sense, blind for a significant fraction of every waking moment, and you have never once noticed. Because your brain edits those moments out before they ever reach your conscious experience. What you perceive as a smooth, continuous visual world is actually a highlight reel. A curated sequence of stable moments, with all the motion and blur and gap quietly removed. The editing happens so far below the surface of awareness that the result feels like raw experience. Like reality, unfiltered. But the editing goes even deeper than that. Not only does your brain remove the traces of its own eye movements, it also conceals its own predictions. Remember that the brain is constantly generating expectations about what it is about to perceive, based on what it has perceived before. Those predictions shape the incoming signal before you are ever consciously aware of it. When the prediction matches what actually arrives, the brain does something subtle and significant. It reduces the strength of the signal it passes upward to conscious awareness. Because there is no new information to report. Everything is as expected. The prediction was correct, so the brain essentially says, quietly, automatically, nothing to see here, and moves on. Only the unexpected gets amplified. Only the things that do not match the prediction are flagged as important, as worthy of conscious attention. Surprise is what the brain pays attention to. Confirmation is what it quietly absorbs and files away. This means that much of what you see, hear, and feel on any ordinary day is not really being perceived in the full sense at all. It is being confirmed. The brain checks incoming data against its models of the world, and where everything matches, the experience is largely generated from the inside, from the model itself, rather than freshly from the senses. The world you move through is, to a striking degree, a world your brain has already imagined before it arrives. And what shapes those predictions? Everything you have ever experienced. Every pattern your brain has learned. Every expectation that context quietly installs before you are consciously aware of it. There are networks in the brain, vast, layered systems, whose entire function is to maintain and refine these predictive models of the world. They draw on memory, on context, on the patterns of everything that came before, and may use all of that to shape what you are about to perceive. Not after the fact. Before. By the time sensation reaches the parts of your brain associated with conscious awareness, it has already passed through layers of prediction and filtering and interpretation. What arrives at the threshold of experience is not raw sensation. It is sensation that has already been compared, adjusted, and shaped by expectation. And the effect of those expectations is not just organizational. It is sensory. Expectations literally sharpen what you perceive. When your brain anticipates a particular pattern, a familiar voice, a known face, a sound you have heard many times, it pre-activates the relevant neural pathways. It gets ready. And because it is ready, the signal, when it arrives, is processed more quickly, more cleanly, with greater apparent clarity. You hear what you expect to hear more clearly than what you do not. You see what you are looking for more vividly than what surprises you. The sensory world is not a level playing field. It is weighted, invisibly, by everything your brain already believes about what is there. This is why a name, once you learn to recognize it, seems to leap out of a crowded room. This is why a native speaker hears the sounds of their language as crisp and distinct, while the same sounds feel blurred and indistinguishable to someone hearing them for the first time. The sounds are identical. The brain that receives them is not. Experience trains expectation, and expectation reshapes experience. The world you perceive is not just constructed from what is out there. It is constructed from what your brain has learned to look for. And all of this, the depth built from flat images, the gaps filled, the motion edited out, the predictions hidden, the senses sharpened by expectation, all of it happens without effort, without awareness, without any sense that anything unusual is occurring. You open your eyes and a world appears. Fully formed. Immersive. Continuous and rich and perfectly believable. And the most extraordinary thing about it is how completely invisible the making of it is. There is something quietly unsettling about this idea, once you sit with it long enough. The reality your brain builds is not neutral. It is not an objective reading of what is out there. It is biased, shaped, in ways both subtle and profound, by what you already believe. What you expect to find is, in a very real sense, what you are most likely to see. This is not a flaw in unusual minds. It is a feature of every human brain, running quietly beneath the surface of every perception. The predictive systems we explored before, those vast networks constantly generating expectations about the world, do not just prepare your senses for what is coming. They actively bend the incoming signal toward the model they have already built. When evidence arrives that fits the model, it flows smoothly into awareness. When evidence arrives that contradicts it, it faces resistance. Sometimes it is weakened. Sometimes it is reinterpreted. Sometimes it does not reach conscious awareness at all. Your brain, in the most literal neurological sense, is built to confirm what it already believes. And when the predictive machinery is working too hard, when it begins generating patterns where none truly exist, something stranger happens. The brain does not simply fail to perceive the world accurately. It perceives something that is not there at all. It hallucinates order. It finds faces in static, meaning in coincidence, intention and randomness. Because a brain trained to find patterns in a world full of patterns will sometimes find them even in noise. This is not madness. It is the normal overshoot of a system calibrated for a world where most patterns are real, where most regularities mean something. The same machinery that allows you to recognize a friend's face across a crowded room also, on occasion, creates certainty where there is only ambiguity. And once a perception locks in, once the brain commits to a particular interpretation of what is happening, the neural circuits involved begin to reinforce one another. Feedback loops form. The regions that generated the interpretation send signals back to the regions processing the raw input, strengthening the interpretation further, making it more stable, more resistant to revision. The experience becomes self-sustaining, held in place not just by the incoming data but by the brain's own internal loops amplifying it. This is why first impressions are so powerful and so hard to revise. This is why a belief, once formed, tends to gather evidence in its favor and deflect evidence against it. The locking in is not a conscious decision. It is something the architecture of the brain does automatically, because stable representations are more useful than perpetually uncertain ones. Somewhere beneath all of this, deeper still, further from awareness, there are gates. Not literal gates, of course, but neural mechanisms that function very much like them. Systems whose job it is to decide, before you are ever conscious of a signal, whether that signal is worth sending forward at all. Unconscious filters that sort the continuous flood of sensory information pouring into your nervous system every second and determine what gets elevated toward awareness and what simply does not make it through. These gates operate on criteria you did not consciously set and cannot consciously inspect. They are shaped by past experience, by emotional significance, by the brain's current state of arousal, by what has proven important before. And their decisions are made in milliseconds, long before anything resembling a thought is formed. By the time you become aware of something, by the time a sensation or an idea or an impression rises clearly into your conscious experience, it has already survived an extensive selection process. It has already been filtered, evaluated, flagged as relevant, and passed through layers of unconscious processing that have shaped and colored it in ways you will never directly perceive. What feels like immediate, unmediated experience is actually the end of a long journey. A journey that happened without you. A journey your brain completed before you even knew it had begun. The unconscious is not a dark, buried chamber somewhere beneath your real self. It is the majority of what your brain does. Moment to moment, the vast bulk of neural processing happens below the threshold of awareness, evaluating, predicting, filtering, preparing, and only the final, curated output is handed to conscious experience. The unconscious does not wait for your conscious mind to finish thinking before it shapes your perception. It has already shaped it. It is always ahead. In the noise, your brain generates an enormous amount of internal activity that has nothing to do with the external world, random fluctuations, spontaneous firing, the constant background hum of a system maintaining itself. If all of that reached you, if every flicker of neural noise became a conscious sensation, the experience would be overwhelming, incoherent, unlivable. so the brain edits it out. It has mechanisms for distinguishing signal from self-generated noise, for suppressing its own internal chatter before it can contaminate the picture of the world it is trying to maintain. You never hear most of what your brain says to itself. You only ever receive the cleaned, filtered, organized transmission, the version your brain decided was worth presenting. The quiet you experience right now, the sense of simply existing in a clear and coherent moment, is itself a product of this constant, invisible editing. And then, layered over all of it, there is attention. If the brain's predictive systems are the architects of your reality, attention is the light that decides which parts of the building you actually see. It is the mechanism by which certain parts of the world, and certain aspects of your own inner experience, become vivid and real, while everything else recedes into a kind of background from which you are barely aware. Attention is not simply awareness. It is selective processing. When you attend to something, truly direct your focus toward it, the brain allocates more resources to analyzing it. More neural real estate. More processing depth. The signal is handled more thoroughly, held longer, compared against more stored knowledge. What you attend to, you genuinely perceive more fully than what you do not. This is not a metaphor. Neuroimaging studies show clearly that attended stimuli generate stronger, richer patterns of brain activity than unattended ones, even when the sensory input is identical. Attention does not just change your experience of something. It changes the actual neural processing of it. It physically alters what your brain does with the information. And the effects on experience are striking. Attention brightens. It sharpens. It makes colors more vivid, sounds more distinct, sensations more precisely located. Things you focus on genuinely look different, clearer, more detailed, more present than the same things seen in peripheral awareness. The world is not uniformly experienced. It is bright at the center of attention and dim everywhere else, and the brightness is real, not imagined. Think of what it means to be truly absorbed in something, a piece of music, a conversation, a view that stops you in your tracks. The richness of that experience, the sense that something is fully real and present and alive, is not just a feeling. It is what deep attentional processing actually produces. The brain going all the way in. And attention can work in the other direction too. It can widen. It can soften. Instead of narrowing to a point, it can expand to take in a broader field, less detail in any one place, but a more spacious, panoramic quality of awareness. Open attention versus focused attention produce genuinely different experiences of the world, because they involve genuinely different modes of neural processing. You can, in a very real sense, zoom in or zoom out on reality. Not by changing what is there, but by changing how your brain is handling it. A narrowly focused mind and an openly aware mind are inhabiting, in an experiential sense, different versions of the same moment. This is why a sky that you have walked under 1,000 times without noticing can, on a single evening when something in you opens and slows, suddenly look vast and extraordinary and almost unbearably beautiful. The sky did not change. Your attention did. And with it, the reality your brain was willing to build from it. What becomes real, what rises fully into your experience, vivid and present and felt, is, in no small part, a matter of where your attention falls. The world is always larger than what you perceive. Richer, more textured, more full of detail than any moment of experience can contain. Attention is the instrument through which you reach into that fullness and draw something particular out of it. And the remarkable thing is that this reaching, this act of choosing, consciously or not, where the light of awareness falls, is something you have more agency over than you might think. Not total control. The unconscious gates will always be working. The predictions will always be shaping the signal. The brain will always be editing before you ever know what is happening. But attention itself, at its surface, is something you can move. Something you can soften or sharpen, widen or narrow, rest in one place or gently redirect. And in doing so, quietly and without drama, you change what is real to you. Your brain does not give every sense equal time. It cannot afford to. The machinery of perception is powerful, but it has limits, and when demands rise in one area, resources have to come from somewhere. So the brain makes choices. Constant, unconscious, ruthless choices about what to process fully and what to let fall into the background. When a task requires intense visual concentration, your auditory processing quietly dims. When you are straining to hear something faint and important, the visual world around you becomes slightly less sharp, slightly less present. This is not distraction in the everyday sense. It is the brain actively reallocating its resources, suppressing the senses it does not currently need so that the ones it does can operate with everything available to them. This cross-modal suppression happens without your knowledge and without your consent. You do not decide to hear less clearly when you are reading something difficult. The brain decides for you. It looks at the task, determines what is required, and adjusts the sensory landscape accordingly, turning up what is useful, turning down what is not. And the same principle extends beyond the senses into the way reality is structured around whatever you are doing. Different tasks do not just change where your attention goes, they change the entire grain of your experience. A task that requires fine detail pulls the world into close focus, making the immediate and specific feel large and important. A task that requires broad situational awareness opens the frame, making the wider context feel more present. The world is not the same world in both cases. It has been reshaped, quietly and automatically, to fit what the moment demands. Reality, in this sense, is always task-adjusted. Always tuned. What feels like a neutral, objective experience of being somewhere is actually an experience that has been calibrated to what your brain believes you need right now. And then there's accuracy, that quality we might hope perception would always prioritize above all else. Fidelity to what is really there. Truth. The brain is not primarily interested in accuracy. It is interested in usefulness. It is interested in getting you through the moment effectively, in supporting good decisions, in keeping you oriented and functional. And when accuracy and usefulness conflict, the brain does not hesitate. It chooses usefulness. Every time. Priorities overrule accuracy not because the brain is poorly designed, but because perfect accuracy, representing the world with complete fidelity in every detail, is computationally impossible under real-world conditions. Something always has to give. And what gives is always the thing the brain has judged least important to what you are currently trying to do. This is a strange kind of intelligence. It produces a reality that is reliable enough to navigate, responsive enough to be useful, and shaped, always, invisibly, by a hierarchy of priorities you never consciously set. Time moves differently under attention. This is something almost everyone has felt, the way a moment of intense focus can make an hour vanish, or the way a single frightening second can stretch into something that feels almost slow. These are not illusions in the dismissive sense. They are real differences in the way the brain is processing time. When attention is deeply engaged, when you are absorbed, concentrated, fully inside a task, the brain's time-stamping mechanisms run differently. The moments are not being individually marked and stored with the same granularity. The brain is elsewhere, busy, and time slips past without being fully registered. Afterward, it feels compressed. Shorter than it was. Under high arousal, under stress, under the kind of sharp alertness that comes with fear or urgency, the opposite can happen. The brain accelerates its processing, takes in more detail per second, and the result is that individual moments feel extended. Richer in detail. Slower. Your experience of time is not a clock. It is a product of how the brain is allocating and recording experience. And it shifts, fluidly and continuously, with the state of your attention. There are researchers who have demonstrated something even more striking about attention, that it can be physically nudged. Using weak electrical currents applied to specific regions of the scalp, scientists have been able to influence attentional focus, shifting where people naturally direct their awareness, altering the quality of their concentration. The electricity is subtle, far too gentle to be felt. And yet its effects on attention are measurable. This is remarkable not because it opens the door to external control, the effects are modest, but because of what it confirms about the nature of attention itself. It is a physical process. Attention is not some abstract quality of mind hovering above the biology. It is electrochemical. It is a pattern of neural activity, subject to the same physical forces as everything else the brain does. It can be measured. It can be nudged. It is, in the most literal sense, made of matter doing something. And the brain that does the attending is not fixed. It learns. One of the most quietly extraordinary findings in modern neuroscience is that perceptual training genuinely changes the brain's ability to perceive. When people practice a visual discrimination task, learning to distinguish between patterns that are very similar, very subtle in their differences, the relevant regions of the visual cortex physically change. The neurons become more precisely tuned. The discrimination becomes sharper. The person, afterward, sees something that their earlier self could not. They have not just learned to pay attention. They have learned to see. The brain has reorganized itself, restructured the very hardware of perception, so that what was once invisible becomes visible. What was once noise resolves into signal. This is experience reshaping not just behavior but the underlying machinery of reality itself, changing what the brain is capable of delivering to consciousness. The world a skilled musician hears, the world a trained radiologist sees in an X-ray, the world an experienced sommelier tastes, these are not the same worlds available to the untrained perceiver. They are richer, more differentiated, more real in the specific domain where training has done its work. Which means that the reality any of us can access is not a fixed ceiling. It expands with what we practice attending to. But perception is not only a matter of sensory input and attentional allocation. There is another layer, one that runs deeper, in some ways, than all of the others. And it is the one we perhaps least expect to find shaping what we see and hear and feel. Emotion. The idea that emotions influence perception is familiar enough in the loose, everyday sense, that we see the world through the lens of our mood, that grief makes everything feel gray, that joy makes the morning look different. But the neurological reality is considerably more precise and more strange than that familiar idea suggests. Emotion does not just color experience after the fact. It enters the perceptual process directly. The regions of the brain most associated with emotional processing, particularly the amygdala, are in constant communication with the sensory cortices, sending signals that shape how incoming information is interpreted before it fully reaches awareness. Emotional state modulates the sensitivity of perception. It adjusts the gain. It changes what the brain is primed to notice and how much weight it assigns to what it finds. When you are anxious, the brain becomes more attuned to threat. Ambiguous faces read as hostile. Neutral sounds trigger alertness. The perceptual system has been recalibrated by the emotional state, and it delivers a world that reflects that recalibration. Not because the world has changed, but because the instrument reading it has been retuned. And alongside emotion, the body itself contributes. Not as a passive receiver of experience, but as an active source of data that the brain uses to interpret what is happening. Your body is in constant conversation with your brain. Heart rate, breathing, muscle tension, the state of your gut, all of this flows upward continuously, and the brain treats it as information about the current situation. It uses the body's state as evidence, as context. When the body is calm, the brain interprets ambiguous events one way. When the body is aroused, heart faster, breathing shallow, muscles primed, the brain interprets the same events differently. The body's report shapes the meaning the brain assigns to what is happening. This is why standing at the edge of a high place feels more frightening when you are already tired. Why the same difficult conversation lands so differently on a restless night versus a rested morning. The external situation is the same. But the body state the brain is drawing on to make sense of it has changed, and so the experience changes with it. And here is perhaps the most quietly astonishing part of this. The brain does not simply use bodily signals as background context. In a deeper sense, it treats feelings as if they were facts about the world. When something feels threatening, the brain does not first decide, rationally and objectively, whether it actually is, and then produce a feeling of threat in response. The feeling and the perception are not sequential. They are simultaneous. They are part of the same act of construction. The emotion is not your reaction to what you perceived. The emotion is woven into the perception itself. Which means that what you feel, in any given moment, is not separate from what you see. It is part of it. The anxious mind and the calm mind do not perceive the same world and then feel differently about it. They perceive different worlds. Slightly, subtly, but genuinely different, in tone, in weight, in what stands out and what recedes. Your feelings are not commentary on reality. They are part of the raw material from which reality is made. And somewhere in that recognition, in the understanding that emotion and body and brain are not separate systems commenting on a fixed external world, but collaborating to build the one you actually live in, there is something that feels important. Something that goes beyond neuroscience into something more personal, more directly felt. The world you wake up to each morning is not waiting for you, fixed and complete and independent of everything you carry into it. It is, in some profound and literal sense, built in collaboration with you. With your history, your state, your feelings, your attention, your beliefs. You are not a passive observer of reality. You are one of its makers. There is a striking moment that researchers have documented in studies of perception and emotion, one that quietly upends the way most of us think about our own minds. When people are asked to evaluate something, a decision, a situation, another person, while experiencing a strong emotion unrelated to what they are evaluating, the emotion bleeds in. It colors the judgment. Not as a recognized bias they can correct for, but as an invisible contribution to what feels like a clear and rational assessment. The feeling does not announce itself as a feeling. It arrives wearing the clothes of fact. The brain treats what it feels as if it were objective information about the world. Not all of the time, not without exception, but far more often than we recognize, and far more deeply than conscious reasoning can easily detect. An emotion is not tagged, in experience, as something arising from inside you. It is experienced as a quality of the thing you are looking at. The anxious person does not feel anxious about the world, they feel the world is anxious. The difference is subtle. The implications are enormous. Emotion is not a filter applied over a neutral perception. It is one of the pigments the brain uses to paint the picture in the first place. Remove the emotional contribution and you do not get perception plus clarity. You get something flatter, less organized, harder to navigate. Patients with damage to the emotional centers of the brain do not become more rational and objective in their choices. They become, in many cases, less capable of making choices at all. Because emotion is not the enemy of good perception. It is part of its structure. And yet, for all its usefulness, the emotional layer can also override the rest of the system entirely. When emotion runs high enough, fear, grief, rage, overwhelming joy, the careful, calibrated, evidence-weighing machinery of perception can be swept aside. The brain stops comparing the incoming signal against a nuanced model and starts responding to the emotional signal as the dominant reality. Everything gets organized around the feeling. Other considerations recede. The world narrows to whatever the emotion is directing attention toward, and that narrowed world feels, in those moments, completely and undeniably real. This is not a malfunction. It is the system working as designed, prioritizing what it has registered as urgent. But it means that at the extremes of emotional experience, the brain's construction of reality shifts most dramatically away from anything we might call objectivity. Not toward delusion, necessarily, but toward a world that is intensely organized around a single emotional truth. Even at quieter levels, in ordinary moments, ordinary days, context does the same work in miniature. The same sensation, placed in a different context, becomes a different sensation. A touch that feels tender in one moment feels intrusive in another. A sound that is soothing in one setting becomes irritating in another. The physical signal at the sensory receptor is identical. What the brain makes of it depends on everything surrounding it: the situation, the relationship, the expectation, the mood, the accumulated meaning of 1,000 past experiences with similar signals. Context is not just background. It is an active ingredient in what the sensation becomes. The brain does not process the touch or the sound or the smell in isolation and then add context afterward. It processes them together, inseparably. The meaning is baked in from the beginning. Nowhere is this more vivid, or more consequential, than in the experience of pain. Pain can feel like the most raw and unmediated of all sensations. The most undeniably physical. And yet pain, more than almost any other experience, reveals how thoroughly the brain is involved in constructing what we feel. Pain is not a simple alarm signal sent from damaged tissue to a passive receiving brain. It is an interpretation. A conclusion the brain reaches about what is happening and what needs to happen next. The same degree of tissue damage can produce wildly different levels of experienced pain depending on context, expectation, attention, and meaning. Soldiers wounded in battle have reported feeling little pain in the immediate aftermath of significant injuries, because the context, the overwhelming urgency of the situation, effectively modulated the brain's pain response. People in chronic pain can find that their suffering intensifies when they focus on it and diminishes when genuinely absorbed in something else, not because the underlying condition has changed, but because attention is one of the variables the brain uses to determine how loud to turn the pain signal up. Pain is the brain's best current guess about the severity of a threat to the body. And like all of the brain's guesses, it is shaped by everything the brain knows and feels and expects. It is real, deeply, undeniably real, and it is also constructed. The placebo effect lives in this same territory, and it is far more remarkable than the dismissive way people sometimes speak about it suggests. When a person takes a treatment they believe to be effective, even if that treatment contains no active medicine, measurable, physical changes can occur in the body. Pain decreases. Anxiety lifts. Symptoms genuinely improve. Not because the person has been tricked into feeling better while remaining physically the same, but because the belief itself has triggered real neurochemical changes. The brain, convinced that healing is underway, releases its own pain-reducing compounds, modulates its own stress responses, shifts its own physiological state. The placebo effect is the brain rewriting the body's reality using only the signal of expectation. It is one of the clearest demonstrations available to us that the mind is not a passenger in the biological system, observing from the outside. It is a participant. An active one, capable of producing real physical change through the mechanism of belief alone. In time, which we have already seen bends under the pressure of attention, warps further still under the influence of emotion. The research here is consistent and striking. Negative emotional states, and particularly threatening ones, tend to expand time. Moments feel longer than they are. The threatening stimulus receives more processing, more neural resources, and the result is a sense of duration that exceeds the clock. Positive emotional states tend to compress time. Moments feel shorter, pass more easily, leave less of a trace. But beyond the valence of positive and negative, the intensity of emotion itself is a factor. Strong emotion of any kind disrupts the normal flow of experienced time. A moment of profound grief and a moment of overwhelming joy both distort duration in ways that ordinary moments do not. The emotional system pulls the brain away from its ordinary timekeeping into something more immediate, more consuming, more fully present to itself. Time, like everything else in experience, is something the brain produces rather than something it simply reads. Now consider the body, not just its emotional signals, but its physical position in space. And the way that position, quietly and without announcing itself, sculpts your sense of the world around you. Studies have found that physical posture influences the way people perceive their environment in measurable ways. The effort required to climb a hill is perceived as greater when you are tired or carrying weight. Distances appear longer when you are physically depleted. A hill looks steeper when you are wearing a heavy backpack than when you are not. The physical state of the body changes the brain's model of what the terrain demands, and the result is a perception that reflects that changed model, not the objective gradient of the slope. Standing tall, it turns out, makes certain tasks feel more manageable. Slumping changes not just how others read you, but how you read the world. Expansive posture is associated with a different cognitive and emotional state than contracted posture, and those states produce genuinely different perceptions. The body is not simply reacting to a world the brain has already assessed. The body's state is part of the assessment. And movement, the act of moving through space, changes the perceptual landscape in its own distinctive ways. When you are moving through an environment, the visual information coming in is completely different from when you are still. Everything is flowing, shifting, streaming past. And your brain has developed exquisitely precise mechanisms for distinguishing between visual motion caused by the world moving and visual motion caused by your own movement through it. It tracks your body's motion and uses that tracking to cancel out the component of visual change that your movement accounts for, leaving a cleaner signal about what in the environment is actually changing independently of you. This is a remarkable computational feat, performed continuously and invisibly. Without it, every step you took would produce what would feel like the world lurching around you. Instead, the world feels stable even as you move through it, because the brain is constantly subtracting its own generated motion from the perceptual equation. But this also means that the experience of the world shifts measurably with how much you move. People who are more physically active tend to perceive space differently than those who are sedentary. Walking changes attention, changes the quality of thinking, changes the emotional tone of experience. There is something in the rhythm of movement through space that the brain responds to at a fundamental level, as if motion is not just a way of getting from place to place, but a mode of perceiving. a way of being in the world that is qualitatively different from stillness. The brain in motion is attending differently, processing differently, constructing a subtly different reality than the brain at rest. And what ties all of this together, the emotional pigment, the contextual shaping, the body's constant testimony, the movement that reorganizes perception, is the same principle that has been running beneath everything we have explored so far. Reality, as you experience it, is never simply received. It is always made. Assembled from sensation and expectation and bodily state and emotional tone and movement and meaning, woven together so seamlessly that the construction never reveals itself. The seams are always hidden. The finished surface is always what you see. Your feelings are in it. Your posture is in it. The state of your body, the direction of your attention, the beliefs you carry without knowing you carry them, all of it goes into what the world looks and sounds and feels like to you in any given moment. The world outside is real. But the world you inhabit is something more than that, and something stranger. It is the world outside, met by everything you are, and transformed by that meeting into something that belongs to both. Something peculiar happens when you tickle yourself. It does not work. Or rather, it works far less effectively than when someone else does it. The touch is identical, the skin is the same, the sensation travels the same neural pathways, and yet the experience is completely different. Not just slightly different. Fundamentally, categorically different. The reason is that your brain knows when you are the one doing the touching. It predicts the sensory consequences of your own actions before they happen, and when those predictions are confirmed, when the sensation arrives exactly as expected because you generated it yourself, the signal is dampened, quieted, marked as self-produced and therefore less worthy of attention. Because a sensation you caused yourself carries far less new information about the world than a sensation that arrives from outside you. The brain maintains a continuous distinction between what you are generating and what the world is delivering to you. Every sound you make, every movement, every action, the brain is tracking these and using that tracking to separate your own contribution to the sensory stream from everything else. What comes from you is coded differently from what comes from outside. Not dismissed, but weighted differently. Treated as known rather than new. This distinction is fundamental to having any coherent experience of being a self in a world. Without it, the line between you and everything around you would be far less clear. You would not know, at the most basic perceptual level, where you ended and the world began. And the brain's answer to that question, where you end and the world begins, is maintained by something researchers call the body model. A continuously updated internal representation of your own body, its shape, its position in space, the location of its parts relative to one another, the boundaries of what belongs to you. This model is not fixed. It is dynamic, probabilistic, and, as a series of remarkable experiments have shown, surprisingly easy to update. In the rubber hand illusion, a person's real hand is hidden from view and a realistic rubber hand is placed in front of them. When both the rubber hand and the hidden real hand are stroked simultaneously in the same pattern, something strange begins to happen. The person starts to feel the stroking is coming from the rubber hand. The brain, receiving synchronized visual and tactile signals, revises its body model to incorporate the rubber hand as belonging to the self. The person begins, in a genuinely felt sense, to own it. And when the rubber hand is then threatened, struck or stabbed, the person flinches. Their stress response activates. They recoil from a threat to something that is not their hand at all, because their brain has decided, on the best evidence available, that it is. The body you inhabit is, in this sense, a model your brain maintains and updates. Not a fixed biological fact, but a living, revisable representation, one that can expand to incorporate tools you use regularly, contract in response to injury, and shift in response to the signals the brain receives about what belongs to you and what does not. And this ownership of experience, the sense that events are happening to you, that you are the one perceiving and acting, does something interesting to memory. Experiences that carry a strong sense of ownership, of personal relevance and presence, are encoded more deeply. They leave a stronger trace. The self acts as a kind of amplifier for memory, flagging experiences that are personally owned as more important, more worth preserving, than those witnessed from a distance. This is why memories of things that happen directly to you have a different quality from memories of things you merely observed. The felt sense of being there, of being the one it happened to, is not just an emotional coloring applied afterward. It is part of what drives the depth of encoding in the first place. But we have been exploring each sense more or less separately: sight, touch, hearing, the body's own signals. And in reality, that separation is itself a kind of illusion. Because the experience you actually have, in every waking moment, is not a collection of separate sensory streams running in parallel. It is one thing. A single, unified, seamlessly integrated experience of being somewhere, in a body, surrounded by a world. That unity does not come from outside. The world does not arrive pre-integrated. The senses are separate systems, running on different timescales, sensitive to different kinds of energy, processed in different regions of the brain. And yet consciousness delivers something that feels utterly coherent. The sound of a voice and the movement of lips arrive together, feel together, mean together. The warmth of a fire and the sound of its crackling and the sight of its light are one experience, not three. This integration, the binding of separate sensory streams into a single unified reality, is one of the most extraordinary and least understood achievements of the brain. And the rules it follows in doing so reveal just how deeply the felt reality is constructed rather than received. The dominant sense wins. When vision and hearing conflict, when what you see does not match what you hear, vision almost always overrides. This is the basis of ventriloquism. You know perfectly well the sound is not coming from the puppet's mouth, and yet the experience is that it is. The visual signal places the sound, and the auditory system accepts the placement. Reality is renegotiated in favor of the stronger or more spatially precise signal. But the relationship between senses is not always a simple hierarchy. In certain conditions, touch can override vision. Smell can alter taste so completely that the same food becomes a different food. The timbre of a sound can change the perceived texture of a surface you are touching. The senses are in constant conversation, constantly influencing each other, and the final experience is always a negotiation, a multisensory consensus that the brain reaches behind closed doors and presents to you as simply what is there. Cross-sensory illusions make this construction spectacularly visible. The McGurk effect is one of the most striking. When you watch a video of someone saying one syllable while the audio plays a different syllable, you hear a third syllable, something between the two, created by the brain's attempt to reconcile conflicting audio and visual speech information. You cannot choose not to hear it. You cannot override it by knowing how it works. The integration happens before conscious awareness can intervene, and the result is a sound that does not exist anywhere in the physical signal, only in the brain's constructed version of it. Even color, that most apparently direct of visual experiences, is substantially a creation of the brain rather than a property of the world. The physical reality is wavelengths of light. The experience of red or blue or green is what the brain makes of those wavelengths, a translation, an interpretation, a quality that exists in the experience of seeing rather than in the light itself. And the brain's construction of color is not purely mechanical. It is influenced by context, by surrounding colors, by memory and expectation and the illumination conditions the brain infers are present. The famous dress that divided the internet, seen as blue and black by some people, white and gold by others, was not an optical error made by some brains and not others. It was a difference in how different brains resolved an ambiguous illumination cue. Each brain was doing exactly what brains do, making the best inference it could from incomplete information. Each one reached a different conclusion. Each one was completely convinced it was simply seeing what was there. Illusions, of every kind, do something invaluable. They break the spell. They give us a glimpse, however brief, of the machinery that normally operates in total concealment. When you look at an image and see movement that is not there, or see two colors as different when they are identical, or hear a sound that was never in the signal, you are seeing the construction rules operating in the open, applied to a situation they were not designed for, producing a result that does not match the physical reality. And crucially, knowing about the illusion rarely makes it go away. You can be fully informed about how a visual illusion works, understand the optics, trace the geometry, explain it to someone else, and still see it. The perception persists in the face of the knowledge, because the construction happens at a level of processing that knowledge cannot reach. Logic operates after the fact. The building is already finished by the time you arrive to inspect it. This is one of the most important things illusions reveal. Perception is not reasoning. It is not a process that can be corrected by thinking more carefully or knowing more facts. It is a set of deeply embedded processing rules, something more like software running at the hardware level, that operates according to its own logic, below the reach of conscious override. The brain sees what its rules produce. And the rules were written by millions of years of evolution, refined by a lifetime of experience, and optimized not for perfect accuracy but for reliable, fast, useful representations of a world that was mostly, but not always, the kind of world those rules were built for. Illusions are the places where the world stops cooperating with the rules. Where the input is crafted, by accident or by design, to produce a result the rules were not meant to generate. And in those moments, the gap between what is physically there and what is experienced becomes briefly visible. The rest of the time, the rules work. The integration holds. The unified experience is delivered, seamlessly and completely, and you live inside it without ever feeling the joins. One coherent world. One continuous self within it. One unbroken story of sensation and meaning, assembled from separate streams and hidden machinery and probabilistic guesswork, presented to you as simply, undeniably, this. The realness of it is not evidence that it is unmediated. It is evidence of how extraordinarily well the construction works. Consider the Muller-Lyer illusion. Two lines of identical length, each capped with arrows, one set pointing inward, one pointing outward. The lines look different. One appears longer. Every person who has ever seen it knows, upon being told, that the lines are the same length. Many have measured them. And still, without exception, one line looks longer. The knowledge changes nothing. The illusion holds. This is not stubbornness. It is not a failure of intelligence or attention. It is the simple, unavoidable fact that the perceptual process producing the illusion operates at a level that conscious knowledge cannot reach. The construction has already happened. The conclusion has already been delivered. Knowing it is wrong does not reopen the process. The brain that told you the lines are unequal is not listening to the part of you that knows better. This is one of the most important things to understand about how perception works. It is not a conversation you can enter. It is not a draft you can revise once you have more information. By the time experience arrives, the decisions have already been made, and the system that made them does not accept corrections from above. And if you follow that insight far enough, it leads somewhere stranger still. The same brain that constructs ordinary reality from sensory input is also capable of generating reality entirely from within, without any input at all. Phantom limb pain is one of the most vivid examples, the experience of sensation, sometimes intensely painful sensation, in a limb that no longer exists. The signals are not coming from the missing arm or leg. They cannot be. And yet the pain is experienced as completely real, as located in a place, as undeniably present. Because the brain contains a model of the body, and that model can generate experience independently of whether the body part it represents is actually there. The experience does not require the external reality. It only requires the model. Dreams are the same phenomenon at a larger scale. Every night, in the absence of any significant sensory input, the brain constructs an entire world, with objects and spaces and other people, with light and sound and movement and emotion. And during the dream, that world is experienced as real. Not as imagined, not as a faint mental image, but as a fully present reality you are inside. The realness is complete, until the moment it ends. What is it, then, that makes waking life feel different from dreaming? What is the signal that distinguishes the real from the imagined? Because clearly there must be one. Most of the time, most people navigate the difference without difficulty. Researchers have found evidence for what might be called a reality monitoring signal, a brain process that tags certain experiences as externally generated and others as internally generated, helping to sort perception from imagination. This signal is thought to involve activity in the prefrontal cortex, which maintains a kind of running assessment of whether what is currently being experienced is coming in from the world or arising from within. The signal is real, and it is important. But it is also imperfect, and it is not immune to error. In states of high fever, in certain psychedelic experiences, in some psychiatric conditions, the tagging breaks down. Internally generated experiences begin to feel external. Imagine things feel perceived. The boundary between what the mind is producing and what the world is delivering becomes porous, and reality monitoring fails. What this tells us is that the sense of reality, the felt quality of something being genuinely out there, genuinely happening, is not a property that comes automatically attached to external experience. It is something the brain adds, a signal it generates, a judgment it makes and appends to certain experiences and not others. The world does not feel real because it is real. It feels real because your brain has decided to mark it as real. And remarkably, this tagging system can be influenced by training. Through certain meditative practices, through specific forms of perceptual training, through experiences that repeatedly push the boundaries of ordinary reality monitoring, people can develop a different relationship to the reality signal itself. Not to eliminate it, but to hold it more lightly. To become aware of it as a signal, rather than simply living inside its conclusions as if they were inevitable. This is part of what contemplative traditions, across many cultures, have pointed toward for centuries, the recognition that the sense of a solid, fixed, externally given reality is itself something the mind is doing. Not an illusion to be dismissed, but a construction to be understood. And that understanding, when it genuinely lands, changes something in the quality of experience itself. Now let us turn to time. Because everything we have been exploring, the building of space, the integration of the senses, the body model, the reality signal, all of it happens inside something. All of it is wrapped in the experience of time flowing forward, of moments following one another, of a continuous present moving through a past toward a future. And that experience, too, is something the brain constructs. The physical world does not come prearranged into past and present and future. Physics offers a universe where time is a dimension, not a flow, where all moments coexist in a way that has nothing to do with the felt sense of a present moment moving through them. The experience of now, of a present that feels immediate and alive and different from memory, is something that happens in brains. It is not a feature of the universe that brains happen to detect. It is a feature of the way brains process information. And the brain's processing of time is not faithful. It edits, as we have seen it edit everything else. Events that happen in close temporal proximity get grouped together. The brain binds them into a single perceptual unit, a chunk, and experiences them as simultaneous or nearly simultaneous, even when they are not quite. This grouping serves a purpose. It is what allows you to hear rhythm in music, to connect cause with effect, to experience a sequence of images as continuous motion rather than a series of stills. But it means that your experience of when things happen is not a precise readout of physical timing. It is an interpretation. a grouping the brain has imposed on a sequence of events. There is something even more extraordinary than this. Research has established that conscious awareness of a sensory event lags behind the event itself by somewhere between 1/3 of a second and 1/2 a second. The neural processing takes time. The construction takes time. And by the time you become aware of something, the moment you are experiencing as now is already, in physical terms, the recent past. Your brain knows this, in a sense, and compensates for it. It timestamps experiences differently from when they were processed, effectively backdating them to the moment the stimulus actually occurred, so that your experience of the present feels current even though it is technically delayed. You are always living, in a subtle way, slightly behind the physical present, and the brain is continuously papering over that gap to maintain the illusion of immediacy. But it goes further. The brain is not merely processing and then backdating. It is also previewing. The predictive systems that shape perception, those vast networks constantly generating expectations about what is coming next, give the brain something like a preview of the immediate future. By predicting what is about to happen with sufficient accuracy, the brain can begin preparing a response before the event has fully registered. It can act, in a sense, on what it expects rather than waiting for full confirmation. This is part of why skilled athletes and musicians can respond faster than conscious reaction time should allow. Their brains have built models of the unfolding sequence accurate enough to begin acting before the signal has completed its journey to awareness. They are not reacting to what happened. They are responding to what their brain predicted was about to happen, and their prediction is good enough that it works. The present moment, in the brain's experience, is not a thin knife edge between past and future. It has depth. It includes a just past that is still being processed and a just future that is already being predicted, all folded together into something experienced as the felt now. And underlying all of this, at the most fundamental physical level, is the rhythm of the brain itself. Neural oscillations, the brain's electrical waves, cycling at different frequencies, play a role in organizing perception across time. These waves create windows, periods of higher and lower excitability that repeat rhythmically, creating a pulse in the brain's receptivity to incoming information. Stimuli that arrive at the peak of a high excitability phase are processed more strongly, registered more vividly, feel more real. Stimuli that arrive in the trough between peaks are processed more weakly, may be missed entirely, and if registered at all, feel less salient. The timing of the brain's own waves, in other words, shapes what makes it through to experience and what does not. Reality does not arrive in a smooth, continuous stream. It arrives in pulses, shaped by the brain's own rhythms, and what feels like a seamless flow of experience is partly a product of the brain stitching those pulses together into something continuous. The now you are experiencing is, in this sense, a construction built from multiple timescales of processing, edited and time-stamped and rhythmically sampled and stitched together by a brain that is working, always and invisibly, to present you with the most coherent and useful version of time that it can generate. Not the raw physics. Not the unmediated flow of moments. But a crafted, edited, smooth experience of time that serves the particular kind of creature you are, living the particular kind of life a human life is. There is something both strange and quietly comforting in this. The present moment, this one, the one you are in right now, is something your brain has made for you. Assembled from a fraction of a second ago, colored by prediction, smooth at the edges, given the quality of nowness by a signal your brain generates and applies. It is real. And it is made. And those two things, it turns out, are not opposites. The brain you wake up with each morning is not quite the same brain that fell asleep the night before. Not in any dramatic sense. Not in a way you would notice. But at the level of synapses, the tiny junctions where neurons communicate, the night has been busy. Connections have been strengthened and pruned. Patterns laid down during the day have been reviewed, consolidated, and woven more deeply into the existing fabric of everything the brain already knows. The experiences of yesterday have been quietly integrated into the architecture that will shape the perceptions of tomorrow. And this means that the brain's rhythms, the electrical oscillations we touched on before, are not just a background hum. They are an active part of how reality gets organized across time. As those rhythms shift, so does the quality of experience. In states of high-frequency activity, the mind is sharp and narrowly focused, processing fine detail with precision. As frequencies slow, in the relaxed, open state before sleep, or in the broad, panoramic awareness of certain meditative conditions, the texture of experience changes. The world becomes less sharp-edged, more associative, more inclined toward the peripheral and the unexpected. These are not just different moods. They are different modes of perception. Different versions of reality, each one as genuine as the other, each one a product of what the brain's electrical activity is doing at that moment. Memory runs through all of it, in ways that are easy to overlook. When you walk into a familiar room, you are not perceiving it freshly. You are meeting it with an enormous accumulated structure of prior experience, everything you have ever known about that room, about rooms like it, about the objects in it, about what they mean and what they are for. All of that arrives before you do, in a sense. The memory-based model is already in place before the sensory signal even begins to be processed, and the perception that results is a collaboration between the two. This is why familiar environments feel stable and legible in a way that unfamiliar ones do not. The stability is not primarily in the environment. It is in the richness of the model the brain already has for it. Familiarity is a perceptual shortcut, a way of reducing the processing load by drawing heavily on what is already known, rather than building the representation from scratch each time. The world feels stable partly because memory makes it stable. Because the brain has learned what to expect, and expectation is one of the main ingredients of the experience of a solid, continuous, reliable world. But memory does not only support current perception. It also gets rewritten by it. Every time a memory is recalled, it becomes briefly malleable. It is not simply played back, like a recording. It is reconstructed, reassembled from stored components, in the context of the present moment, with all the current brain's associations and emotional colorings and updates. And when it is stored again, it is stored in its reconstructed form. The memory that goes back in is not identical to the one that came out. This means that memories shift, subtly, every time they are accessed. They incorporate new information. They bend toward the emotional state of the moment of recall. They become more consistent with what you now believe and expect. The past, in a very real sense, is not fixed. It is continuously being revised by the present. And while you are asleep, the revision continues in a more systematic way. During sleep, particularly during the slow-wave stages of deep sleep, the brain replays the experiences of the day. Not randomly, and not passively. The hippocampus, which is central to forming new memories, sends compressed sequences of recent experience back to the cortex, where they are integrated with existing long-term knowledge. The day's events are sorted and filed, connected to relevant prior knowledge, stripped of some of their detail and retained in their essential patterns. This offline replay does something important to the reality you will perceive tomorrow. By integrating new experience with existing knowledge during sleep, the brain updates its predictive models. The world you wake up to will be encountered with a slightly more refined set of expectations than the one you went to sleep in. Sleep, in this sense, is not a pause in perception. It is a recalibration of the machinery that produces it. Which is why reality genuinely feels different after a good night's sleep. Not just clearer in the ordinary sense of alertness. Different in texture. More integrated. More coherent. The predictions are better. The model is more up to date. The seams between incoming experience and existing knowledge are smoother. Sleep is the brain doing maintenance on the system that constructs reality. And when the maintenance is done well, the construction runs better. And underlying all of this, the updating of memories, the refinement of predictions, the recalibration of perceptual models, is a capacity that makes it all possible. One of the most extraordinary things about the brain. The fact that it can change. Neuroplasticity. The ability of the brain to reorganize its own connections, to strengthen or weaken synapses, to reassign regions to new functions, to rewire itself in response to experience. This capacity is most dramatic in early development, but it never entirely stops. The adult brain remains plastic, more constrained than the infant brain, but still fundamentally capable of structural change in response to what it repeatedly does and experiences. Every new skill you learn, every habit you build, every relationship that changes how you think, these leave physical traces in the brain's architecture. The brain you have is the product of everything that has happened to it. It has been shaped by your history in ways that are, at the microscopic level, literally structural. The connections are different. The patterns of activation are different. The predictions the brain generates are different, because the hardware generating them has been modified by experience. And the brain does not show you this. You do not feel your synapses strengthening. You do not notice the quiet reorganization happening during sleep. You do not experience the gradual updating of the model that shapes what you perceive. The plasticity is invisible, as all the machinery is invisible, and you receive only its outputs, the experience of a world that makes slightly more sense than it did before, of a skill that feels slightly more natural, of a place that has become familiar. Change happens below the surface. The surface itself, the experienced reality, feels continuous. and nothing feels more continuous than the self. From moment to moment, across sleep and waking and all the discontinuities of ordinary life, there is the experience of being the same person. Of a continuous I that persists through time, that has a history and a character and a perspective that is consistently its own. This felt continuity is so fundamental to human experience that it is difficult even to question. It simply seems obviously true. But the brain's continuous sense of self is also a construction. Not a fiction. The experiences are real, the body is real, the history is real. But the seamless, unbroken narrative of a single continuous self is something the brain actively generates, just as it generates the seamless, unbroken narrative of a continuous world. It does this by integrating memory, bodily sensation, emotional continuity, and the ongoing predictions of a self-model, a representation the brain maintains of what kind of entity it is, what it values, how it tends to respond. This self-model is updated by experience, just as the world model is. It drifts, over years and decades, in response to what happens. And yet the experience of it is always of something stable, always of a self that has been here all along. The gaps are edited out. The discontinuities are smoothed over. The self, like the world, is presented to you as more seamless than it actually is, because seamlessness is what the brain has learned to produce. Now consider what happens when that seamless, waking construction is suspended. Every night, without exception, you enter a state in which the ordinary rules of reality construction are dramatically loosened. The external sensory input drops away. The body lies still. And the brain, freed from the work of modeling an external world from incoming data, turns inward and builds a world anyway. Dreams are not vague or insubstantial in the moment of having them. They are fully realized. They have light and shadow and depth and movement and other people with faces and voices. They have narrative logic, however strange. They have emotional weight that can be as powerful as anything waking life produces. And they are experienced, while they last, as completely real. The same brain that constructs waking reality constructs dreamed reality. The same mechanisms of prediction and pattern completion and sensory simulation are operating. The difference is not in the quality of the construction but in the source of its inputs. Waking perception is anchored by continuous external data. Dreaming perception is driven almost entirely by internal generation, by memory, emotion, expectation, and the brain's own spontaneous activity. And yet the experience, from the inside, is largely indistinguishable. The dreamer does not usually experience the dream as a dream. They experience it as happening. As real. The reality signal, the tag that marks experience as externally given, is active during dreams, which is why the dreamed world feels present and genuine rather than obviously imagined. This is a remarkable fact. The same signal that tells you the waking world is real is also running during sleep, tagging a completely internally generated experience with the quality of realness. The signal cannot tell the difference, because the difference is not in the signal. It is in the source of the data being processed. Hallucinations work similarly. Whatever their cause, high fever, certain substances, extreme sensory deprivation, specific neurological conditions, They involve the brain's generative machinery producing experience that the reality signal marks as external. The person experiencing them is not imagining something and mistaking the imagination for perception. They are perceiving something their brain has generated, with the full stamp of realness that perception normally carries. This is why hallucinations are so convincing and so difficult to dismiss through reasoning alone. The experience has the same signature as genuine perception. It feels the same way from the inside. Because the brain cannot distinguish between its own internally generated experience and externally sourced experience when the right signals are active. The line between dreaming and hallucinating and perceiving is not a line in the external world. It is a line in the brain's own processing, and it is a more conditional, more movable line than we usually imagine. What this means, taken as a whole, is something quietly profound. The reality you inhabit when you are awake is not a fundamentally different kind of thing from the reality you inhabit in dreams. It is the same basic process, the same generative, predictive, constructive brain operating under different conditions, with different inputs, producing different results. Waking life is more constrained, more anchored to the external, more corrected by incoming data. But it is not less constructed. The construction is always happening. The generation is always underway. The brain is always, in every state, building the world you find yourself in. And somewhere in the space between sleep and waking, between dream and perception, between the imagined and the real, there is something worth sitting with quietly. The world you return to every morning, when consciousness reassembles itself from the fragments of sleep, that world is waiting for you because your brain is ready to build it again. Not because it was there all along, exactly as you left it, but because you, and the extraordinary machinery you carry inside you, are ready once more to make it real. When you close your eyes and picture a place you love, somewhere you know well, somewhere that carries feeling, something specific happens in your brain. The visual cortex activates. Not as strongly as it does when you are actually looking at something, but in the same regions, in the same patterns, processing the imagined scene using much of the same neural machinery that processes the seen one. The brain does not maintain a clean, absolute separation between looking and imagining. The two processes share architecture. They overlap at the level of the tissue doing the work. This is why virtual reality works as well as it does. Where a person wearing a headset stands at the edge of a virtual cliff and feels their stomach drop, when the hands reach out instinctively, when the heart rate rises, the response is not a mistake or an overreaction. It is the brain doing exactly what it always does, building a model from available sensory data and responding to that model as if it were real. The sensory data is artificial, but the construction is genuine. The brain that built a real cliff from photons and depth cues builds a virtual cliff from the same machinery, following the same rules, with essentially the same result. The felt reality of virtual environments is not a trick being played on a gullible brain. It is the brain's constructive process operating normally on unusual inputs. Because the process was never primarily about the source of the data. It was always about what you do with it. Imagination operates in this same territory. When you vividly imagine a scenario, a conversation you are anticipating, a place you are planning to visit, an action you are considering. You are not simply having thoughts about it in some abstract, purely mental sense. You are running a simulation. A partial, internally driven activation of the same neural patterns that would be engaged if the thing were actually happening. This is not a metaphor. Studies of motor imagery have found that imagining a physical movement activates the motor cortex in patterns very similar to actually performing it. Athletes who practice movements mentally, visualizing the precise execution of a skill, with attention and detail, show measurable improvements in actual performance, without any physical practice having occurred. The brain has treated the imagined repetition as genuine rehearsal, because at the level of neural activation, it largely was. The imagination is not a place outside reality where you can wander without consequence. It is a rehearsal space that uses real neural resources, writes real traces, and shapes real future experience. What you repeatedly imagine, you partly practice. What you vividly picture, the brain partly perceives. And the implications run deeper than motor skills. Imagining an emotional scenario activates emotional circuits. Imagining a threatening situation can trigger stress responses. Imagining something you desire can intensify that desire. The brain responds to its own simulations in ways that are not entirely different from how it responds to events in the world, because the simulation is running on the same hardware. The line between what is happening and what is being imagined is real, but it is not as absolute as ordinary experience suggests. The brain crosses it, in small ways, constantly. When you imagine motion, not just any movement, but the felt experience of moving through space, something similar happens in the vestibular system, the body's balance and movement sensing apparatus. Vividly imagining acceleration, or the swooping fall of a dream, or the sway of a boat, can produce faint but real echoes of the corresponding physical sensation. The system that normally responds to actual motion is being partially activated by the imagined version of it. This is why reading a gripping novel can feel, at its most immersive, almost physical. Why a vivid memory of a frightening moment can produce a ghost of the original fear. Why music, which is purely sound, can create the distinct sensation of movement or space or flight. The brain is not just thinking about these things. It is, in some partial and distributed sense, experiencing them, because experience and imagination are not housed in different buildings. They share the same rooms. Now consider what happens when the brain's ordinary boundaries are temporarily and profoundly relaxed. In altered states, whether produced by certain substances, extreme meditation, sensory deprivation, or other means, the careful thresholds that separate sensory channels, that distinguish self from world, that maintain the normal grain and scale of experience, can shift dramatically. Colors become more saturated. The sense of depth changes. The boundaries of the self feel less fixed. The ordinary compression and filtering the brain applies to experience is loosened, and something comes through that normal waking consciousness keeps mostly quiet. People who have had these experiences often describe reality as feeling expanded, not distorted in a frightening sense, but opened. As if the ordinary version had been a narrower channel than it needed to be, and something wider was briefly available. What is happening, at a neurological level, is that the normal predictive filtering is being disrupted. The brain's tendency to dampen familiar signals, to suppress the expected, to attend only to the novel and the important, these mechanisms are temporarily altered, and the result is that more of the raw signal reaches experience. Familiar things become unfamiliar again. The textures of the world, normally processed and filed without comment, become vivid and strange and worth attending to. The experience of expansion, in this sense, is not the brain receiving something it never normally had access to. It is the brain releasing the compression it normally applies. The underlying richness was always there. The ordinary brain was managing it, reducing it to something workable. And when that management is suspended, the workable version gives way to something larger. Whether that larger version is more real or simply less filtered is a question that does not have a clean answer. But it points at something important, that the version of reality ordinary consciousness presents is already a reduced version. Already a selection from something more. Now step back from the individual brain and its individual construction of experience, and consider something that may be the most profound layer of all. Human beings do not build reality alone. Language is one of the first things to understand here, and one of the most surprising in its effects. It is tempting to think of language as something that comes after perception, that we first see and feel and hear, and then find words to describe what we experienced. But the relationship runs the other way too, and often more powerfully. The language you have for something changes how you perceive it. This has been demonstrated across a wide range of perceptual domains, but color is one of the most studied and most striking. Different languages carve up the color spectrum differently. Some languages have a single word for what English calls blue and green. Others make distinctions within what English treats as a single color that speakers of those languages perceive as clearly different categories. And when researchers test perception, not just naming, but the speed and accuracy of perceptual discrimination, speakers of languages with more distinctions perceive those distinctions more sharply. The category boundary in the language becomes, to some measurable degree, a boundary in experience itself. Language sharpens where it draws distinctions, and blurs where it does not. The words you have available do not just label what you see. They influence the resolution of what you are able to see. This is not because language creates something out of nothing, or because people whose language lacks a word for something are somehow incapable of perceiving it at all. It is more subtle than that. Language trains the brain's categorical machinery. It establishes the boundaries the brain uses to organize incoming sensation into meaningful units. And those boundaries become perceptual shortcuts, ways of grouping and separating that operate before conscious thought, shaping the landscape of experience from the inside. A wine expert who has spent years developing a vocabulary for flavor does not just have more words for what they taste. They taste more. The language has trained the perceptual system to make finer distinctions, to separate signals that a less trained palate would merge into a single impression. The words came first, in a sense, and the perceptions followed. This works in the other direction too. When language lacks the vocabulary to make a distinction, experience tends to be blurrier at that boundary. Not because the sensory signal is any less precise, but because the categorical machinery has not been trained to treat that boundary as significant. The signal arrives, and the brain, finding no established category to place it in, handles it less precisely, less completely, with less perceptual resolution. Language is not just a tool for describing experience. It is part of the infrastructure that determines what experience is available to be had. And language does not come from individual brains. It comes from cultures, from communities, from the accumulated and shared cognitive traditions of groups of people living together across generations. Which means that the perceptual world any individual inhabits is shaped, at a fundamental level, by the culture they were born into. Cultural scripts, the shared frameworks, expectations, and interpretive norms that a culture maintains and transmits, change not just how people think about their experience but how they have it. Studies comparing perceptual performance across cultures have found genuine differences in what people attend to in visual scenes, how they organize spatial relationships, how they interpret ambiguous figures, how they balance attention between objects and backgrounds. People raised in certain cultural contexts tend to focus more on individual objects. People raised in others attend more naturally to relationships between objects and the contexts surrounding them. When shown the same scene, they literally notice different things, not because their eyes or visual cortices are different, but because the attentional habits trained by their cultural environment have shaped what the brain treats as figure and what it treats as ground. The culture you were raised in has been training your perception since before you could speak. The categories it considers important have become, over years of exposure, the categories your brain instinctively uses to organize experience. The things it treats as significant have shaped what your attention instinctively moves toward. The reality you experience is not just the product of your individual brain. It is the product of your individual brain shaped by an entire cultural heritage of ways of seeing. Which means that reality, the experienced world, is not only a construction of the individual. It is partly a collective achievement. A shared project that every culture undertakes, in its own particular way, with its own particular emphases and its own particular blind spots. And what is remarkable about this is not that different people live in different realities, though in some meaningful sense they do. What is remarkable is how much overlap there is. How much of the construction is shared. How the basic architecture of the human perceptual system, beneath all the cultural and linguistic variation, produces experiences that are recognizable across every divide. Light and dark. Near and far. Warmth and cold. The face of another person. The sound of a voice that is speaking your name. These things feel real to every human brain that has ever encountered them. Because beneath all the construction, beneath the predictions and the models and the cultural training and the linguistic shaping, there is a world. Incomplete as our access to it may be, partial and mediated as our experience of it always is, there is something there, something real, that the construction is trying, in its own elaborate and imperfect way, to make sense of. And every brain that has ever done that work, every mind that has ever turned raw signal into experience, that has ever built a world from the inside out and found itself, against all odds, connected to other minds doing the same thing, is part of something genuinely extraordinary. Not just the receiver of reality, the maker of it. In collaboration with everyone who has ever shared a language, a culture, a perception, a moment of genuine recognition across the space between oneself and another. There is a kind of seeing that has nothing to do with the eyes. It happens in the space between people, in a crowded room, in a shared meal, in the silent understanding that passes between two people who have known each other a long time. It happens in the way a city feels different to the person who grew up in it versus the person visiting for the first time. It happens whenever a shared framework, accumulated over years of living within a particular culture, quietly decides what is worth noticing and what can safely be ignored. Culture does not just influence how people think about the world. It shapes the most basic habits of visual attention, where the eye moves first, what it lingers on, what it skips over entirely. Researchers who have tracked eye movements across cultures have found consistent, measurable differences. People raised in East Asian cultural contexts tend to spend more time looking at backgrounds, at relationships between objects, at the scene as a whole. People raised in Western contexts tend to move more quickly to the central object, the focal point, the individual thing. Same image. Same eyes. Different worlds. These are not trivial differences in style or preference. They are differences in what the brain registers as significant. What the attentional system has been trained, over a lifetime of cultural immersion, to treat as the point. And because attention determines what gets processed deeply, what gets encoded, what shapes future expectations, what becomes part of the model, these differences ripple outward into the whole fabric of experience. The norms of a culture are not just social rules. They are attentional instructions, absorbed so early and so thoroughly that they stop feeling like instructions at all. They feel like simply the way things are. Like reality itself, self-evident and obvious, rather than one particular cultural selection from a much wider field of what could be noticed. And this narrowing happens not just at the level of vision but across the senses. Social expectations alter what we hear, what we taste, what we are willing to feel. In cultures where the expression of certain emotions is discouraged, the perceptual recognition of those emotions in others becomes, over time, less sharp. The categorical machinery for reading emotional signals in faces becomes tuned to what is socially relevant in the environment it developed in. What gets expressed gets recognized. What is suppressed becomes harder to see, not just in others but in oneself. Social context goes even further than this. It does not just train the senses over the long term. It rewires perception in real time. The presence of other people, and the expectations they carry, changes the experience of the moment you are in. Wine tastes better when you are told it is expensive, and brain imaging shows that this is not just a change in reported preference. The activity in regions associated with genuine pleasurable experience is different. The brain is not pretending to enjoy it more. It is actually generating more of the neural signature of enjoyment, because the context has changed what the experience means, and meaning is part of what the brain uses to construct the experience itself. Pain is perceived as more intense when a stranger administers it than when a trusted person does the same thing. The same stimulus, the same nerve signals, the same body, but the social meaning of the situation has changed, and with it the brain's construction of the experience. Context does not just frame sensation. It enters the sensation. It becomes part of what the sensation is. And context can reverse emotional meaning entirely. An ambiguous facial expression, one poised between warmth and threat, will be read differently depending on what has just happened, who else is in the room, what the perceiver expects. The face itself is the same. The experience of it is not. The brain reads people the way it reads everything else, through the lens of prediction and context and prior knowledge, building a person rather than receiving one. All of this points towards something that seems obvious once it is stated, but whose full implications take time to absorb. Different brains, shaped by different histories and cultures and emotional landscapes and attentional habits, construct genuinely different realities. Not different opinions about the same reality. Different experiences of it. Different colors in the emotional palette. Different boundaries between categories. Different figures emerging from the same ground. The person sitting next to you is not inhabiting exactly the same world you are. They are close. Human brains share enough architecture and share enough accumulated cultural training that the overlap is vast. But at the edges, in the fine grain, in the emotional textures and the categorical boundaries and the things that naturally draw attention, there are differences. Real ones. Not just in how they think about the world, but in what the world feels like to be inside. And yet, here is the extraordinary thing: shared reality exists. Not just as an approximation, but as something robust and stable enough to build civilizations on. The buildings stand. The conversations carry meaning across the gap between one mind and another. The music moves people who have never met. The mathematics works everywhere. Something is being shared, and shared reliably, across all the variation. How? Part of the answer is agreement. Social reality, the shared world of meaning, of value, of what things are called and what they are worth and how they ought to be treated, is stabilized by collective assent. Money is real because everyone agrees to treat it as real. Laws are real in the same way. The name of a thing, the category it belongs to, the role it plays, these are real in the way that collectively maintained agreements are real. Not arbitrary, but not fixed by nature either. Held in place by the ongoing participation of the minds that share them. Shared beliefs about the world create shared perceptual expectations, and shared perceptual expectations produce shared experience. A community that agrees on what is significant, what is dangerous, what is beautiful, what is sacred, that agreement gradually becomes perceptual. It shapes what the members of the community actually see and hear and feel, not just what they are supposed to say about it. This is a form of collective perception. A community of minds, each constructing its own version of reality, but doing so with shared tools, shared language, shared categories, shared emotional frameworks, shared histories of what has mattered and why. The individual constructions are not identical, but they are coordinated. They are building toward the same model, from the same cultural blueprints, and the result is a shared world that is real enough to live in together. The stability of that world depends on the stability of the agreement. When the agreement fractures, when communities lose the shared frameworks that coordinated their constructions, the shared world becomes uncertain. What seemed obvious to everyone becomes contested. What felt like simple reality reveals itself as a particular version of it, held in place by consensus that is no longer there. This is not comfortable, but it is illuminating. Because it shows, again, that the stability of reality is not something that comes from outside. It is something that is maintained by individuals, by cultures, by communities of minds doing the ongoing work of coordinating their constructions with one another. Reality is not just built. It is maintained. Every day. By all of us. Together. And now, at the end of this long exploration, after following the brain from its first flat images to its construction of depth, from prediction to emotion, from the body's signals to the rhythms of sleep, from dreams to imagination to language to culture to the collective world we build and maintain between us, something is worth saying plainly. The brain amplifies what you expect to hear. In every conversation, in every room, in every moment of listening, the brain is already leaning toward the familiar, already priming the pathways that carry the expected signal, already making it easier for what fits the model to arrive clearly. The voice you know sounds clearer than the one you do not. The word you anticipated comes through the noise while the unexpected one gets lost in it. Even in something as simple as listening, the construction is already underway, already shaping what reaches you. And this small, specific fact, that the brain amplifies what it expects, is a perfect summary of everything we have been exploring. Because that is what all of this has been about. The brain is not a passive receiver. It is an active, anticipatory, endlessly generative system that meets the world more than halfway. It brings to every moment an enormous structure of prior knowledge, expectation, emotional coloring, bodily state, cultural training, and learned prediction. And from all of that, from the meeting of what the world offers and what the brain brings, experience emerges. Your reality is not a window. It is not a recording. It is not a simple reflection of what is there. It is a living simulation, built from prediction, shaped by emotion, filtered by attention, stabilized by memory, and woven together with the realities of the other minds you share your world with. It is the most sophisticated thing any known object in the universe produces. It is what it feels like to be you, in this moment, inhabiting this particular version of a world that has never existed in quite this form before and will never exist in quite this form again. The world you experience is not simply seen. It is created. And the one doing the creating, the endlessly working, endlessly predicting, endlessly constructing intelligence that makes your reality real, is you. Not the you that thinks and speaks and makes decisions. The deeper you. The one working in silence beneath all of that. The one that has been building your world, faithfully and invisibly, since the very first moment you open your eyes. It has never stopped. It will not stop tonight. Even as consciousness fades and sleep arrives and the waking construction gives way to whatever the dreaming brain builds next, the work continues. The model is maintained. The self is held. And when morning comes, and the world reassembles itself around you once more, familiar, vivid, immediate, real. You will know, somewhere beneath the knowing, that it was made. That it is always being made. That its realness is not a given but an achievement. An extraordinary, ongoing, quietly miraculous achievement. Yours.